Hey, thank you very much, Pearl and David. If we could switch the slides off, we can bring Pearl and David into the center without blinding them. Uh, Questions from the panel. I'm going to start with Betsy on the line. Give you the first chance to ask questions, Betsy.
Sure, and I've got a question here for one for Pearl and one for David. Part of what we'll need to do is figure out the interface between data sharing policy and informed consent, the role of IRBs, and in particular in the U.S., the legal requirements regarding those latter two. We all know, as you stated, that the informed consents are too long, not read, not understood, not remembered, and rarely kept. So the forms are clearly outdated. Pearl, what would your recommendations be about statements that this group could make regarding informed consent and any revisions that might occur around data sharing, but also corollary areas that might be advisory to some of the legal agencies here in the United States that might lead those forms to be more manageable, shorter, read, understood, and kept in the pocket by research participants.
Wow, if I had the answer to that. I guess before giving what my suggestion would be, I think this is also a very uncertain area for IRBs. We have the advance notice of proposed rulemaking, which would really turn a lot of IRB review on its head in that it would require an upfront, I call it consent light, for the use of any data or information in research, and would really change many of the IRB responsibilities we currently have. So I think that's getting attention. But if things were to stay exactly as they are, I think the fact that informed consent forms and process are pretty broken is a well-recognized issue. But it seems that there's more and more things you want to make sure the person understands before they provide consent. So I think exploration into, should you have a short form informed consent with appendices for those who are more interested. There's a lot of work going on in terms of doing video consent, where you really have to watch a video, understand it, answer questions at the end to make sure the person actually understood it. I think all of these merit a lot of attention. I think the issue of numbers becomes a true issue, though. I mean, the systems I oversee, we have 7,600 research protocols going on right now. Now, many are under waived consent, but if a video were required for each consent, you can imagine just the logistics of doing that. So I think simplifying, but I think maybe with a shorter upfront consent with, as I said, addenda may be one approach. Sorry, I feel useless in that answer, but.
No, but that's helpful guidance. My next question is for David. You raised the topic or the point of having a harmonized global policy, and I suspect you were referring specifically to IRBs and informed consent. One of the issues that we'll have to deal with is the heterogeneity of the international community, from subject participants all the way up through regulatory agencies. If you were to write a global policy on data sharing that you thought could be harmonized and how it would interface with informed consent or IRBs, what would be the principles that you would articulate?
As far as principles, I think they're already fairly well articulated in the sense of respect for persons, giving subjects the knowledge they need to know to make a choice up front. I like the idea in this if we could somehow force this international standard that subjects would be told about data sharing if it were, likely to occur. I'm kind of on the middle of the fence, and I'm well cited actually, between Pearl and Mark on the spectrum of whether or not you should actually get their consent or just cram it down their throat. And so over the 15 years I've been doing IRB work, I kind of started off on the edge of you have to have consent and subject must be able to withdraw data whenever they want to. And as time has gone on, I've gotten to the position where I think that, more towards Mark's view, that you tell people up front their choice is right at the beginning whether or not that's an acceptable agreement. And that even if it's not, you can't tell them everything that's possibly going to happen with their data over the next 15 or 20 years. They know that up front, and then they don't get a chance to pull the data out later, because that really messes up the validity of the data down the line.
So you really would err on the side of notification.
Yes.
Thank you.
Betsy, any other follow-up questions you wanted to ask?
No, please go ahead.
Okay, I've got a bunch of cards up. Devin, and let's just go around this side. You want to start, Devin?
Thank you all very much. It was a very interesting presentation. So if you take as a premise that informed consent is challenging, which I certainly am no disagreement here, but what then, and also as a premise that largely when you de-identify or anonymize data in accordance with whatever country standards you're following, that you typically don't need to do so as a matter of law, although Pearl, I think it was important for you to note that in some cases that's not enough for some institutions from an ethical standpoint. What are, so if both of those things aren't perfect, what other pieces do you add in to make sure that you are honoring individual autonomy and building public trust in a data sharing environment that we're trying to facilitate?
I'm so glad I'm on this panel. Yeah, exactly. I think it's education and just fessing up with what we do. I mean, I usually will start an IRB talk and say, how many of you have donated tissue or data to research? And 4% raise their hands. I said, everyone raise your hands. People are looking at your stuff under waiver of informed consent. We do it now. So I think we're starting from a baseline where this is a huge surprise to the public to then kind of add on, oh, by the way, we're really sharing everywhere your research consent. So I think what we need is, major education. I think it's a challenge given, I think, the literacy of our population in terms of science, in terms of process of science. But I do think we have to start at the very basic level. When you start looking at the PCORI issues, which is going to be sharing at a very different level, we're going to be dead in the water unless we have the engagement and the understanding of why that's important. So I guess that's where I would start, and then I think some of these things would. And even though David said he's between us, I must admit notification, I think, is a more honest way of doing it. Because I think anyone coming into an institution should know this is what we do, almost a notification of how we use your information. The HIPAA form, too long. Nobody gets to the last few pages that tells people exactly how we use it.
And on the other side of that, I would add, to the extent we can have de-identification processes that really work, that people won't be able to go back like somebody did with the GWAS data and say, hey, I can identify these people. And maybe some real teeth into enforcement of those agreements. Right now, if you do identify somebody, you might get a citation letter from OHRP, but in the end, it's not much more than a slap on the wrist.
Okay. So many of these, the straitjacket that we're in is because of the desire to pay very, very strong obeisance to the maximum, individual autonomy, while at the same time compromising that autonomy by having forms and complexity that they can't possibly understand. In fact, that we don't really accept that they can opt out of, which is Mark's point, everybody's point. So as you know, there have been recent publications suggesting, with respect to CER and usual care research, that we allow situations in low risk research where we don't have informed consent, and change the paradigm, because that's actually impeding not only research but good medical care and the ability to construct learning healthcare systems. So the question is, can that same logic be applied here? This is at some level low risk research. It's not no risk. I mean, the re-identification and misuse of data is not a totally trivial thing, but the community and collective benefit from doing so is very, very large, which is part of the rationale for the new ethical frameworks proposed for CER. So that's really the question. Can we develop other ethical protections, including groups that look very, very closely at the value of the research, and looking at IRBs not to so much approve the consent form, which is never read as the protection, but serving as the real protection as a sort of community voice or community consent to say that this is reasonable and not too egregious a violation of individual autonomy, and improve it in that way and inform the patient that a group like this, which might include patients like themselves, has approved this, and this is how we'll be doing it. We're using your data if you participate.
I think that is a logical way to proceed. And you mentioned the CER and waiver of consent, and in the changes to the European directive that just came out, they've actually put that in, that you would not require consent for CER studies, with kind of the odd proviso that people can still refuse to participate if they want, but besides that. So I think that is a good way to go. And I think, I'm not sure you have to set up other committees than IRBs. What you need to do is tell the IRBs that it's okay to waive consent in certain situations. And part of the problem we have in the U.S. particularly is we have so many IRBs, and they just interpret things a little differently. So you have a lot of difference in individual settings. And perhaps, that is a reason to go to another countrywide process or committee with fewer participants that makes these decisions regarding the future use. So I think that is a valid proposal of some type.
I would agree, and just for the record, our IRB interprets everything absolutely correctly, so we don't have that problem. But I think any IRB would feel a little bit nervous about just trust us, the right research will go on, thinking about the open access issue. I think with from my perspective, I would really want who is looking at if this is a good research or not. Is there community risk in this research that actually, is above and beyond and would, in fact, need review? Something that would dump back the hopefully small number, but not zero number, that actually would be better off if they were reviewed. So I think your kind of system would depend on how open the access was for getting the data out. At least in my mind.
Joanne?
I wanted to bring back a question that was asked to a different panel yesterday. I think we're going to be living in the current world since we don't have these informed consents, so we're going to be living in this world for a while. And the question, I think you asked it yesterday, was that if you're a teacher and you have 24 students in a statistics class, you wanted to access some data, you wanted your students to access it, do the reanalysis 25 times, and then, present their data, publish it, whatever, this reanalysis of, let's say, a major research study or research program. So yesterday we asked the panelists, did they think that that was a valid use of the research, the clinical research? So I wanted to ask you, whomever wanted to comment, do you think, given the informed consents that you all see day in and day out, do you think that that would be a valid use of the research that was conducted?
I'll just start and say, with the consent forms we have today, something like that is generally not contemplated. I mean, the farthest we go is, say, the FDA and government agencies from other countries may see your medical records and research records, and any companies involved with the sponsor, or NIH, HHS representatives. But we don't start talking about high school students, et cetera. I think that's something, again, there needs to be foresight up front to tell people. Now, if you couch it broadly enough, then fine. Because I don't think the IRB is going to be looking at the value or the validity of the secondary analysis. The IRB's focus is primarily, is this going to hurt the subject? And of course, by hurt, you get into the issue of an actual breach of confidentiality that causes them some harm versus a dignity claim, that my data was used without my consent.
But can I follow up with that? You said if you couch it carefully, but the point that Mark has been making, and both of you, is that these informed consents really don't, people don't read them, they don't understand them, they don't, what does it mean if we couch it carefully? People aren't really consenting to that. They can't contemplate what the real risks are? Is it who are we protecting?
So couch carefully was probably not the right term. Maybe bluntly state that your data will be available in a de-identified fashion for secondary analysis by other parties. And, now that's not going to mean much to the average person, I don't think. But at least that way you said out front, look, the stuff will be spread and shared. And hopefully you will not be identified in that process.
Actually, as you asked that last question, well, first of all, to answer your first question, I could see many IRBs saying this is de-identified data, it's not a human subject, do whatever you want to do with it. I could see others saying, no, I don't. I think that's beyond the realm. I had another great thought, and now I goofed it up. Oh, I know. In terms of, the consent form itself, I think in many ways it's the IRB's second bite at the apple to actually know how the investigator is going to use that data. Remember I said the inconsistencies issues. So I think on some level, once you see what the investigators have proposed, it is another, I think, metric the IRB looks at and says, oh, wait a minute. This either needs to be stated in a much more black and white manner, or, hey, what is going to be the review process for these secondary reviews?
I'm not really on this panel, but can I answer quickly?
We like you.
Okay, thank you. I'm an honorary member. It doesn't, to answer your question, Joanne, it doesn't trouble me, that happens as long as, because again, I'm not, and it's not really a normative value. It's not normative. It's just, I'm just saying as a reality, it's a notification issue, I'm not saying it shouldn't be. I'm just saying that's the reality of what we're living in today. What I would focus on is notification, not consent. And I would focus on some kind of intermediary to say that is ethically acceptable to use the stuff in that way. A learned intermediary. I would not, honestly, I wouldn't have a free-for-all in this area. I would have some kind of control in the way that we have IRBs, imperfectly, but we have a set of values about minimal risk that's applied by a group of people in a very localized basis. Maybe it should be different, maybe it should be more than localized, maybe it should be regional, maybe it should be national, maybe the values should be articulated better and more clearly. But as long as somebody who is competent and has some kind of set of explicit values that they're applying, I don't have a problem with high school students using it for a stat class. Just my opinion.
I have one very quick comment on one quick question. So the comment is just to reinforce what Steve said. I think that in a lot of other areas of consent, the behavioral economics literature has really taken hold, and so nudge is everywhere. So having defaults and then opt-outs of defaults could be something that might be useful to think about. The question is just a very simple one, which is there any empirical data on the extent to which different IRBs have abandoned HIPAA de-identification as a norm versus invoked HIPAA de-identification as a relevant norm? Because it would be good to see whether it sounds like Mark suggests that most IRBs don't think HIPAA de-identification is enough, whereas I think, Pearl, you were suggesting that certainly some IRBs do, and it would be great to have empirical data. I don't know if there is any.
There's none that I am aware of. Maybe the privacy panel later this afternoon can give you some more information, but no.
I'll just say anecdotally, just because I'm involved with various IRBs, that it's a spectrum, and there are some IRBs that feel that if you take the HIPAA identifiers off, that's just fine. There's others that'll say, no, there still could be codes even with the HIPAA identifiers removed, and therefore it is still identifiable, and the provisions don't change. So what you get is a lot of interpretation of the conflicting sets of regulations out there, HIPAA, the HHS regulations, the FDA. And, various IRBs come up with various ways to interpret those.
If I could just add, I think the one piece in there that really is the sand in the gears is genetic information. In that, HIPAA does not cover genetic information unless it's tethered to an identifiable link. It considers it health information, but not yet identifiable. And, in terms of at what point is whole genome or whole exome sequence identifiable, given the number of reference sets that are now available, it's dial an opinion on that. So I think that is something that makes it a little bit more difficult.
So early on, there was the issue of opting out that was brought up. So to what degree do we know how much of a problem this would be for patients getting the option, the opportunity to opt out, and is this influenced by actual culture? So if you look globally, what are the parameters that we need to think about? Because I think of it from a patient advocacy point of view, and you hear patients say, I want to participate, I want to be in, but is this really a distinctly American view, or is it how so how do we know how frequently this will happen, and what are the cultural influences?
All I have to go on is anecdote and subject complaints over the years, and I can think of one case where we had a potential subject in a research study who said, hey, wait a minute, what's this part about sharing with government agencies in other countries? I have HIV. And in that particular case, the person decided they weren't going to join the study because they didn't like that idea of their health information being shared across borders. N of one, right? We do sometimes get subjects who become unhappy with their research experience for a variety of reasons and to say they want to withdraw their data. Now there's some pretty strong FDA guidance, actually a rule, I think, that you can't remove data that was collected before they withdrew their consent. So it comes up from time to time. I don't have a good sense of an overall number, or, an actual, some real data.
I would just, I think your question, was more the opting in as part of the consent. I'll do this, but I don't want to do that part of the research. I also am not aware of data, but that never stops me from having an opinion. I think there are a few things that are difficult. One is to really, again, you already have this long consent form. How do you give it enough detail to know what the person is opting in or opting out of? And we've seen some examples like your data will only be used for cancer research. And the person says, I hate cardiologists. I don't want no cardiovascular research. Well, what do you do when it's a cardiac tumor? I mean, so you end up getting, unfortunately, these, we have people out there worried about this stuff. So number one is, can you actually have it detailed or broad enough in a way that a person really knows what they're opting in for? The other huge issue is the tracking of it. And actually in talking with the omnibus and the proactive opt-in for secondary uses, at least some of our industry sponsors have said they really don't have a mechanism where they can reliably track that. So we don't want to offer it if we can't with a straight face say we can respect it. So I think, but overall, I think, there obviously there's some attractiveness to it in terms of respecting autonomy.
This whole discussion reminds me of actually financial data, mortgage forms that aren't understandable, right? And we sign up on something and it says, do you consent to have your data, can we share it with third parties? And, and if you check it, you don't know what happens because it goes to a third party that then goes to a fourth party and it goes to other parties for multiple purposes. And when that data is shared, there is both risk to us, right, depending on what data we originally shared, but there's also benefit, right? Now I get better marketing and I get better deals. Are there models and approaches that we can learn from sort of the whole financial data that we could look to and learn from?
I think there are. I think, as you said, there's risk, but there's also benefit. You get a mortgage. I think we have done a poor job globally in research to feed back information to participants, either on an aggregate level. I think now the demand is for individual research results, but I think if people could more see what's in it for them, I think that would go a long way. We can't give them a mortgage, but at least give them information.
Yes, I'm curious what your experience is when I call the fear factor. I mean, a few years ago, IRBs got sanctioned or institutions got sanctioned, federal funding got shut off. So it's easier to say no than to say yes if you have any doubts. What's your experience? I mean, is that an issue, or have we gotten beyond that?
So we're at a period right now where OHRP has very much toned down their compliance process. FDA, in my impression, has continued about the same. But sure, as an IRB and I'm a compliance officer, I'm looking at my next audit. And I'm saying, hey, what are we going to get faulted for? And so we come up with our interpretations of the requirements, and we follow them to a T because, the last thing you want as an organization is to get a compliance letter from an agency.
I mean, the ding dong we're coming for not-for-cause site audit, just warms your heart. But the other thing we do, aside from kind of those big sentinel events, I look at the compliance letters that are posted, particularly on the OHRP website, as well as the warning letters on the FDA website. And I think that has really been a lot of how consents have become like coral reefs. Like, ooh, these good friends of mine in Detroit, look what they got dinged for. Ooh, we better, now include that. So I think in many ways it's not just the threat of shutdown, but it's also watching what's happening to your friends.
That was the point I made earlier about you need somebody from a position of authority to tell IRBs, hey, this is okay. It's going to be okay to de-identify data and have OHRP and FDA, some public notice that FDA and OHRP aren't going to come around and cite you anyways for following some other directive.